Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 5 of the Extremely Non-Extreme podcast. This week, my guest is Darrin Rosha. We have him as a guest because he has been active in both political parties in recent years as a Republican, and he's also been a military officer, a colonel, in fact, who served in Iraq, a political candidate in a past life, and a member of the Minnesota Board of Regents. Darrin has had active roles in business, and he is a practicing lawyer. Uh, More than anything, though, I chose Darrin as a guest because he brings intellect, wit, and common sense to a political world, that often is lacking in that department. So, the topic I will be discussing with Mr. Rosha today is Republican politics after Donald Trump. Right now, as I see it, President Trump's version of the Republican Party is ahead in the battle for Washington, D.C. To continue winning without the president's heavy influence, however, Republicans will need to pick a new leader at some point before 2028. I'll argue in the Principle-Based Politics blog this month that Trump's loss of influence will happen abruptly and relatively soon. So a new leader should be under development right now, I believe, Darrin. And I also suggest that the GOP not even try to replicate the current strategy, which only Mr. Trump can pull off because of his unique political gifts. And quite frankly, he might be the only one that knows what that strategy is. Are we in agreement so far, Darrin, with those prefatory remarks?
Outside of the complimentary things you said that have, created a standard that I don't necessarily feel up to meeting, I think everything else was fairly accurate. So,
Okay. I want to talk next about animals with tusks. Knowing you, you probably have been called a unicorn by some people, and I certainly have been called a rhino, which of course is an acronym for a Republican in name only. The Republican mascot, the elephant, is yet a third tusked animal. Darrin, what's the difference between a rhino and a real Republican elephant? I guess to continue my metaphor, what criteria must one meet to ride atop the Republican elephant across the country today?
that's a very good question, and I would actually suggest that you almost have to put a pin on the calendar and say this is what it means today. I was I love wearing Bluetooth headphones when I'm out on the zero turn. We got a pretty decent sized lawn, and I was listening to some stuff about the drafting of the Constitution, and then the first the government under the Articles, followed by the Constitution, and the battle between Jefferson and Hamilton. Just a nice refresher. And you realize how many times it appears that the parties almost flip flop on different topics, but I've never cared for the term rhino, only because I feel like if I had, this putting my attorney's hat on, if I could cross-examine everybody that's part of either party, I can find the points where there may be a little bit of nuance or a little bit of disagreement with what would be a platform position. Because Republican in name only would, literally ends the first time you support the platform on anything, because it's no longer in name only. It's on these 80% of the items in the platform. To me, the biggest difference between the two parties is really the role of government. And I tend to be, from a personal standpoint, I tend to identify with the Jeffersonian concept with respect to the individual states, and how, a strong federal government pulls the government away from the people. But also there's the Hamiltonian kind of conservatism, where you don't necessarily want this you want government to be restrained, and I think there's that constant balance. And so when I decide whether I think somebody is a conservative versus and now it's even hard to say liberal, because liberal has taken on such a different meaning, and it's really almost been replaced on the left by progressives. or that title, because the classical liberal were people that I served on the board with, 30 years ago that came out of the greatest generation. This was the World War II generation, and they were more of the classical liberal perspective on what government is. They'd be far afield from where the Democratic Party is today, which is really much more of a progressive institution. And in fact, Republicans today, accept a lot of things that have changed in the last 30 years that Republicans and Democrats wouldn't have accepted, in as recently as maybe even the early 90s, if not the late 90s. But so when you talk about it, really comes down to whether you think government has an active role in addressing the issues in people's lives. And what's interesting is it has a lot to do with sort of my journey to where I am in my political involvement, because when I came out of high school, I was very much a product of the K-12 education system and, sort of the broadcast media and whatever, where, I had been told that if I have virtue, I'm a Democrat. And if I'm a greedy, selfish person, well, then that's a Republican. Well, nobody wants to be that. Or certainly they don't want to be characterized that way. And so I had a fairly lengthy career as a periodic state delegate to the state DFL convention, very active with the DFL party. I ran in my early 20s a couple of times for the state legislature in a very Republican district. Had some close results. Was not elected, but learned a tremendous amount in that process. And working in campaigning teaches you a lot. You learn a lot about people and you learn a lot about the process. But I spent a long time in my career where I was not. I would go to a lot of caucuses where I would say, yes, I agree with your goals, but I don't think that gets us there. I don't think that, I don't think that does what we say. In fact, I think it ends up having the opposite effect. And so, I spent a long time with that and I had been so preconditioned to sort of assume that all Republicans were, people they were primarily selfish, and they very much were focused on protecting their wealth from doing good things for society. And this is a much longer answer than I should probably give between questions here, but I'm just giving you a little bit of a perspective without going into why I made the transition. But when I went to when I was finally convinced by someone to go to a Republican caucus, I was amazed at how the conversation was very different than I expected it to be. It was very much about the values that you associate with the Republican Party, if you can look at it objectively. I mean, some people are so emotionally tied up in the partisan battle that it's virtually impossible. But it was just people that were talking about, wanting to keep government from regulating the heck out of their lives, all the way down to their personal beliefs, let alone managing their personal finances and being responsible. They truly felt that government being involved where it didn't belong actually had negative effects on people.
Sure.
Much as a parent who wants their kid to go out and figure things out themselves and learn things themselves, empowers their kids more than a parent that does everything for them, in which case their kids don't ever develop those skills. And so I kind of discovered they weren't as they had been described. And so coming back to my original point, it really does come down to the difference, and it can be a very close difference, and there can obviously be a lot of overlap even between the parties, especially when you get down to social issues, which don't line up perfectly with the parties, and as you know, can be somewhat problematic, because you can be 80% on all these other main issues, and then one issue will throw you, out of the good graces of a specific party.
Well, today in 2025, and as we head toward the 2026 midterms, I'm wondering, what is the Republican Party today? I'm aware that there is a MAGA group. There is what I call the Trumplican Party, which I don't mean that to sound as derisive as it sounds.
Sure.
But there is Donald Trump's party. And what else is there of the Republican Party today?
Well, I think, I mean, you raise again, a very good point. it is such a unique environment, and it's if we had to try to go back to 2005 and convince Quentin at that time what we have today. I mean, if you had gone back to any of us back in the 90s and said, Donald Trump is going to someday be president of the United States, we would consider it to be a reality show concept, right? Yeah, and let alone a reality on a couple of occasions.
To some
Um,
extent, it is.
what's that?
To some extent, it is.
Well,
We're living in a
yeah, obviously,
reality show.
to the extent it's reality, and to the extent that it's got all kinds of twists and turns that keep you tuning in, I guess that would be true. But it's the Trump phenomenon is really something, and it's also very interesting in how it has changed the categories of voters, right? And I think you've talked about this in previous things I've watched, where the working class turned out for Trump, which has historically been the Democrat space, and so how do you change that? And to me, it's been really interesting because I feel like the Democratic Party is really having a hard time reading the room, and has for some time, because okay, so the working class is who you say you support, that's who you say you stand for, and that's who's been your base all these years. I don't know that calling them Nazis is necessarily going to bring them back into the fold. I don't think that's a good strategy. It may feel good to you at the time. You may feel virtuous and you may feel somehow morally superior, but A, you're wrong because they're not. But you're certainly not going to be inviting folks, and you're galvanizing is what you're doing. The Trump phenomenon, it's so hard for people to analyze, and even folks that I think you have conversations with. I think there's going to be varying levels of difficulty in having very objective conversations because of the emotion that is built up in it. He really has the capacity to drive strong feelings in people. And I sometimes feel like when you talk about the unicorn thing, and I have heard that on occasion, um, part of having had half of a life involved as the most conservative Democrat in the room, which I would say is accurate. And I could give you some interesting stories about some interesting people of some interesting import that have been part of that dialogue for me as to where whether I was really a Democrat, certainly of the current age. But having had great relationships, and really having a trust and confidence that there are a lot of people that hold those views, that are good people. They're sincerely held views. I just don't think that they're correct. I posted a little joke on social media about today's politics is, one person said, one assistant coach says, I think we should throw a pass. The other one says, I think we should run the ball. And the first one says, well, that means you're a Nazi and I hate you. It's like, no, you can disagree on policy and not necessarily be bad people. You just have a different perspective for whatever reason. Having had that life, and having had the life that I've had, with people that I think I align with a little bit more on the political spectrum, particularly in the role of government, I don't hate Trump. I find his style not to be optimal. It's not, I'm a Calvin Coolidge fan. I like the dignity of the office. I enjoy. And that's not necessarily to say that he's not dignified, but he definitely has a different way of communicating than I'm used to in my life or through history. And so, and the last point I'll make on this before I break I've got to work on these answers being shorter. But the thing with Trump is, I look at it, and it's such a remarkable style to have the president of the United States attacking people, verbally, with which I would point out is almost always a reaction. I mean, very rarely does he ever go after. I mean, it's always somebody has said something nasty about him and he punches them back. That's his style, right? But part of me thinks that in this modern social media age, and especially because anybody that says that there hasn't been a traditional bias to the left in the media is simply not being truthful, or they're not able to really evaluate, because Hollywood and the media have, in all our lifetimes, has tended to trend to the left, if not hard left. You almost wonder if someone has to be as aggressive and assertive as Trump to survive on the conservative side of things. You have Romney, you have McCain, two long-term public servants. I remember I was not really active with the Republicans much in those earlier races, and I remember Democrats calling them Nazis, and I'm like, John McCain? Really? I mean, yeah. Well, it's an effective tool. It's an effective tool to drive a wedge between that person, and that it gets you off policy, it gets you away from the policy discussion, and it gets you to personalities.
Right.
And both Romney and McCain kind of cowered to those accusations or those labels. Donald Trump doesn't. He just puts it right back in your face. And in the social media age, one has to ask the question, certainly from the conservative side, is that maybe the difference? Is that why he's found success where other, qualified candidates haven't been successful? So,
Well, his style has worked for him, I argue. He's gotten himself elected president of the United States twice. And there's no doubt that President Trump and his Republican Congress have attained some political wins in 2025. How well do you believe the party is doing at the national level in terms of finding lasting improvements for which voters will give Republicans credit in 2026 and then 2028? Is there anything sustainable here in Trumpism?
well, you're asking a compound question, there's um, uh, trying to kind of take that on piece by piece. I have been amazed at how well, and Minnesotan Tom Emmer as the whip has, played a significant role in pushing, this political, this policy agenda. Um, I've been amazed that they've been able to do it. Because one of the things that I've noticed, like, the Minnesota legislature has been such an interesting contrast because when the Democrats or when the DFL has had small majorities, they've been able to get everybody on board, including DFLers from the few remaining rural districts and so on and so forth. When it's come down to key legislation, they have pushed they have stuck together and gotten things done. My observation over time is the Republican Party's had a harder time doing that. You've had some folks from Alaska and some other other places where they've deviated from the agenda, so to speak. And for Trump to have been able to hold people together, and oftentimes it appears like it may even be in the context of a threat. The going back to the MAGA voters in those districts and saying, well, hey, you're either with us or you're not, and if you're not, we're going to find someone who is. And most people seem to perceive it as a continuing movement of sorts, and so they've been there. But the it's almost impossible to roll back a government bureau. It's almost impossible once these things are created to roll them back. And the extent to which the Trump administration and the congressional leadership has been able to pass things that do pull things back. I didn't expect it. It's actually exceeded my expectations as far as what was actually capable or what was actually possible, rather. The only thing is, because he went with the supply side, kind of this Reagan-esque supply side approach to taxation. It's interesting because it's really just extending the same tax regime that the previous, that was under Obama and then into Trump and then into Biden, and it was set to expire. So it's really an expiration issue, right? But by doing what they've done on the spending side and not, gaining the revenue that would have come from letting those cuts expire, you have a lot of people saying, well, wait a minute, the deficit is continuing to increase. But
I'm one of those people.
But like the Reagan era, the presumption is, and you and I don't know the answer. Well, time will tell whether the economy is juiced to make up the difference and to actually whittle away at the deficit. I can't stand the deficit. I can't stand federal debt. And this has been, I felt this way since I'm 17 years old at my first caucus, right? Because I don't think if there's anybody that should be aggrieved, it's people who haven't been able to vote yet, because they're going to inherit this debt. And to me, it's immoral. And it's so inappropriate I guess theoretically, if you're in a war and you're doing all you can to preserve the republic so the next generation has a republic to live in or a country to live in. But But as for what we're doing now, where it really is, we're all living this unimaginable lifestyle to just a couple generations ago, and we're doing so much of it on debt. I think that's absolutely inappropriate. So I am very hopeful. I'm certainly not an expert in the area, but actually nobody is because things always end up surprising us. But if the economy does pick up and cover that spending, then he will have been very successful, and the voters will reward him and his team for that. If it stalls out, you will have the benefit of having reduced the federal bureaucracy, but they will hold it against the president and members of Congress if the economy does not, continue to have sustained growth in that respect. There, very few people are going to be, pleased that the federal government is 15 or 20% smaller than it was at the beginning of the term if they can't afford their mocha latte in the morning. They'll be more focused on that.
The numbers I see indicate that the popularity of the Republican Party is much better than the popularity of the Democratic Party nowadays. But still, the Republican Party is at 42 to 45% approval rating among all voters. If you look at Donald Trump's raw numbers in his 3 elections, they increased each time. His percentage increased each time, but they still haven't topped 50%. 49.8 was Trump's percentage last time. And is that the apex? Or do you foresee the popularity of President Trump and his party, I'm going to call it his party, uh, getting any bigger than it is today?
The only time I think that president, and first of all, polls are so fickle, I could dig back for quotes from so many other folks when they talk about the value of polls, but because they're an interesting snapshot, how they're phrased, how they're framed is so important. But if you really want to have a super popular president, you almost have to have a massive crisis. The military conflict is huge, right? I mean, you think about the extent to which not only was Bush reelected, Bush W type, but he survived. His party actually did well in his first midterm. Well, that was after 9/11, and people were in a very different place than as we just sort of plod along, year to year. FDR had the Depression followed by World War II. I mean, those kinds of things have a big impact on the popularity of a president and so on. It's hard to maintain that, especially because your critics tend to have a much stronger platform during your term than your supporters do. And especially, again, when you have with the Republican and the media and so on, I think that really kind of stands out. The polls about Congress and the polls about the parties, they don't mean much to me at all. When someone says Congress has a 7% approval rating, it's like, right, but we don't vote for Congress. We vote for a member of the House and we vote for a couple senators. What are their numbers? Those are the numbers that really matter.
Right.
Because one of the things I found is that people, people don't like anyone else as member of Congress. They like their own, maybe, right? But but as far as the rest of them, and they don't have to actually make a choice, so it's not even a real question. But I think that if the president is able to stay in the high 40s, I think that that's success, especially with the fairly kind of no, that's not, I'm trying to think of the right word here. The skepticism that is the American ethos right now. I think Biden had a problem staying in up in the high 40s, and so for Trump to have that challenge, it's we're not a very positive population when it comes to those kinds of questions, and part of it is because that positivity doesn't sell like criticism does, and so I think that that's just a kind of a feature of American politics is that you're going to have challenges with those kinds of numbers.
I think pollsters have been very much called into question as far as their usefulness. after the last few elections in
Sure.
particular. They had very
Yeah.
poor elections. Donald Trump seems to defy pollsters. But so I think what really matters is who will people actually fill in their oval on their ballot and vote for that person. And as I see it, and tell me if I'm wrong, through the eyes of a Trump supporter or a MAGA member, voting Republican in November of 2024 meant voting to deport 10 to 20 million illegal immigrants, to stop funding foreign wars, to end those wars, which Trump said he would do immediately, to not touch entitlements, and to release Jeffrey Epstein's client list. Since taking office, President Trump has waffled on deporting many millions of farm and hospitality workers. He's continued funding Ukraine. The war in Israel continues. He's failed to stop any wars, and although he may disagree with that, he's eliminated millions from Medicaid eligibility in the future, and ultimately said there is no Epstein list. So will MAGA show up in the 2026 midterms and vote Republican?
Um, so this is maybe it's a singular question, but it's based on a very lengthy premise. And
I'm
you know,
famous
I
for that.
I appreciate that. I appreciate self-awareness is always the first step, Quint. It's a good question. But so, I have never sort of felt like I can speak for the MAGA crowd. I'm not like a card carrying member. I'm surrounded by people who are very openly and proudly consider themselves Make America Great Again advocates or supporters, members, if you will. Um, I feel like your question maybe gives them too much credit for knowing specifically what those items were. I don't know that you could ask very many MAGA hat wearing folks what are the basic tenets of his campaign, or were the major tenets of his campaign. And so I think that may be kind of overstating those specific expectations. And then of course there's the question about, well, where are we in his term? And because I don't recall specifically, and maybe I was just busy with other things, but I don't recall the deportation thing being as much of an issue as it was securing the border and implementing the law as written. I'm a pretty big rule of law guy. It was actually part of my role in a deployment was rule of law and ensuring that American troops were within the law of war and so on. The idea that the executive would just simply say we're not going to enforce immigration law on the southern border, even though there were still substantial deportations, that's anathema. It's just I can't. It's just hard for me to wrap my head. It's like, well, then change the law, but don't just not follow. I mean, you want to talk about constitutional crisis is when the executive just says, I'm just going to pick and choose which laws the executive branch is going to enforce. That's very dangerous and absolutely inappropriate. And so I think a lot of things, I think that rule of law stuff and following the Constitution and following statute was a big part of the MAGA passion. And so I think when Trump comes in and says, okay, we're going to steal the border and then we're going to start holding people's feet to the fire on their status, I think, obviously when you get down to the individual stories, a lot of heartbreaking stories, right? Families and, it's tough. It's very tough right now. As it relates to Trump, and wavering, I don't know if that's the word you use, but kind of backing off a bit when it comes to agricultural and hospitality workers and so on. I think that goes pretty strongly to the fact that my observation, and I've heard others talk about it this way, is that Trump is less of an ideologue and more of a pragmatist. And so he's as an ideology or as a policy, he is enforcing it. But when he bumps up against hey, we've been doing this, but now we're learning new things. We're learning that we're going to have some shortages here. We're going to have some challenges here. I'm going to adjust my process because it's going to have this negative impact again, as a very pragmatic approach to what he's doing in this moment. I know some people that are much more ideological, the ideologues in my universe that are mad about that. They're like, no, it should, you gotta follow the rule as it is. And um, but then you have people like a Ben Shapiro, and I don't know if you track him at all, but he's talked about anyone who doesn't provide a service, isn't of value. And it's like, well, that's softer on the language of the statute, right? Because you're starting to make this other measurement, and he kind of gives his reasons. Do they pay taxes? Are they a drain on social services, and so on and so forth? That is even less ideological because the law still says what it says, and you either apply it equally to everybody, or you aren't really following the basic rule of law. On the war stuff, I think that there's so much complexity in what's going on in the geopolitical environment that I think it's hard for a lot of folks, let alone average everyday folks with the red hats, to really be able to say, well, this is happening this way and this is going this way, and I think we'll know over time where some of these things have happened. And I'm speculating that some of the things that I think Trump expected in his relationships with some of the people that are involved, particularly like in Ukraine and so on, I don't think he's getting the reactions and the actions that he anticipated at the outset. But we'll have to see where all that stuff goes.
What about
The
let me ask you about the non-MAGA voters,
Okay.
people that swung Trump or swung Republican, and there were many millions of said people who previously had voted for Biden in 2020, or maybe even had voted for Hillary Clinton or both in 2016. And now they voted for Trump. Various demographic groups he increased his traction in greatly. Uh, I see those people as possibly being chagrined by a persistent feeling of economic and political chaos. They were convinced that Trump would bring order to things, and Trump is a businessman and would be good with the economy, and their kitchen table issues would be handled better than they had been under Biden. And now they maybe still feel just as broke as they felt before, or whatever it is. Will those people swing back out of the right-hand column uh, as a punishment to Trump and the Republicans for not solving their problems, the same way they punished Biden for not solving their problems?
We still have a solid year, and one of they don't have anything to judge it against right now. I think is part of it. But I see that there are a lot of people that are frustrated with a sense of chaos, as you just described. Excuse me. But I think there's a lot more going on with different groups of voters. I think, particularly like in, communities of color. I used to practice law over on Selby over, in St. Paul, right on the line of the Rondo neighborhood, where I was often, if not primarily, in the minority. And it was amazing to me at how kind of fundamentally conservative the Black community is in a lot of respects, but yet they were, very devoted DFL or Democrat voters, and that's one of the groups that you're seeing, especially Black men, starting to move away, and there's some logic to that. I mean, one of the issues is that the Black community, certainly the folks that have been from descendants of slavery, folks that have been here for multiple generations, or many generations. The Great Society is, when I first got involved in politics was not, it was not even 20 years old. It was about 20 years old. And you were still trying to kind of see what exactly was happening with this massive growth in federal government and federal entitlements. We're now at 60 years. And the communities that were targeted by the program have not fared as well as other communities that weren't targeted by these programs. And like, one of the things that's really, really interesting is that Nigerian immigrants out earn the white population, obviously, drawn in large groups, 20 to 30%, but traditional black families that have been around for many generations are about 30% lower than the economic performance of the average white family. And so you have to kind of ask yourself, well, does society make a distinction? There really isn't a distinction between them from a physical standpoint or a skin color standpoint. So what else is going on with this? And you're seeing more and more people in the black community start to say, have we been sold a bill of goods by a government program approach to success as opposed to people pursuing or being more assertive about their own futures and their own success. And I think that you're seeing a lot of that among black males in particular. You also have a lot of social issues where the black community is actually more conservative than the white community. And those things are starting to come to the fore a little bit as well. I think that that's having a bit of an impact. So it almost comes down to the individual voter as to what it was that got them to make that transition. But you're seeing sea changes, right? I mean, you're seeing sea changes in the number of 18-year-old men of all races are not going to college in the same numbers that they had been before. They're going into trades and different things. I mean, this is a really massive change. And what impact is that going to have on people's expectations, the economy, who's successful, who's not successful, and what their expectations are of the role of government. So I would think that a lot of those folks may just sit it out. The big issue with midterm elections is it's the president's party's voters stay home. They just aren't motivated like they are in a presidential election. They just don't turn out. And I had a chance to see this firsthand individually, is where you could have a wonderful campaign, but the president was of the same party that I was running under, and the voter drop off was close to 30%, mostly my voters from that party. And so that's the real challenge for the Republican Party going into this midterm is, will there be a way of motivating voters, whether it's the MAGA voters who may be disappointed that they didn't get everything they were promised right away, or even people that, as you say, voted for Trump in just on the belief that this is less chaos than the previous administration, who turns out? Because I guarantee you that the rock solid Democrat progressive bloc, they're all turning out, and they're going to go out and find people who wouldn't necessarily vote, and we'll just say convince them to vote. And then there will be a smaller group of block of conservative voters. They will vote as well. And so then the question is just who else shows up as to what happens. But I would think that if you had a dollar, it'd be pretty dicey to place it on the president's party in a midterm, just looking historically.
Policy doesn't seem to be particularly in vogue in politics nowadays, but is there a policy platform that the Republican Party can build between now and 2026 or even 2028 that will attract voters? We talked a moment ago about the people who voted for Trump. Maybe they weren't exactly voting for certain policy outcomes. They were voting more for an attitude than a policy. Is there a policy platform that the Republican Party could build?
I agree with your observation. I think that anytime you watch a World War II movie, it's really hard to relate it to our current world. I was really interested to see how long that sense of unity and patriotism would last after 9/11 and going into the Iraq War and so on and so forth, and how many years would it take before people, when you think of how quickly we went from being at war with Japan to rebuilding Japan, it's stunning, right? I mean, how quickly that transition occurred. I don't think it was quite as quick on the German side, but it was actually pretty quick, right? But the idea of to me, the idea that patriotism or this, God bless the USA, anthem, life that we had seemed to have lived for a number of years, to see that go by the wayside where you're almost attacked as being a jingoist or nationalism is a dirty word and that kind of stuff. I think that the left oversold that criticism or the kind of eschewing that. And Trump came in, hugging flags, some some unusual stuff. So that's the attitude thing I think that you're talking about is I think that people do want to have the opportunity to feel good about their country and to feel some level of patriotism and some sense of self-preservation, that being out for your country, being out for yourself does not make you a bad person. That is allowed to some extent. I'm watching the Democrats right now try to recover from that, trying to, because I think they're recognizing that working class base that's your patriotic Lee Greenwood loving American population, and so far every effort they've made has come off as kind of silly. It's like, no, you're going to have to do better than that. You can't just pledge allegiance one time on camera and suddenly people say, oh well, yeah, they're strong America loving Americans again, and so I think that attitude actually is a big part of the attractiveness of Trump to working class voters. As far as the policy is concerned, this is also another one where there's kind of the somewhat ironic and paradoxical position of the left is people calling Trump an authoritarian, a dictator, as he is shutting down federal bureaucracies that he controls. It's like, well, no, that's not actually what an authoritarian or a dictator would do. They would strengthen the power of those organizations and they would use them to go out and impose their will on the population. I do think that from a platform standpoint or a policy standpoint, they want to reduce this bureaucracy. Now, pure speculation on my part, but it seems to be that his intensity in this area is supported a great deal by his experience in his first presidency. I think that Trump, when he came in, and this comes all the way down to this latest Bureau of Labor Statistics, termination, is Trump came in and he inherits a bureaucracy that has been largely expanded and filled by the left. And I think that he was surprised at how many times he found that they were working against his agenda in his first presidency. And so I think that has maybe been a part of the motivation for him to be as assertive as he has in cutting down the bureaucracy and being aggressive in placing his own people in at the higher levels of those bureaus as well. So
I
I
know
think that
you're a political strategist, Darrin, and I think one of the strategy questions Kamala Harris failed to navigate correctly was whether to run away from the past, her predecessor, Joe Biden, and claim to be a change candidate. This is a change opportunity, in my view, for Republicans to not make the same mistake Kamala Harris made, and for future Republicans in 2026 and 2028 to run as change candidates. People love change candidates. Do you see any space for a Republican to run away from the status quo, meaning run away from Trumpism as a successful strategy?
I think it's a very well, a
I'm
lot
talking
of
about a successful general election
right,
strategy. I
right.
am living proof that it doesn't work as a primary election strategy.
Yes, and of course the irony is with respect to your candidacy. I mean, first of all, it's really hard to get a lot of attention in a congressional race that's on the edge of a metro like this. I think, as you probably discovered, but I think your politics would have fit that district really well, or this district, I should say, because I'm sitting in it. And just the challenge is how do you get people's attention? Because I think, especially when you're talking about new top of ticket things, but um, there are a lot of things that could change this. One of the issues is if for some reason Trump doesn't complete his second term, whether for health reasons or or the significant event if the president were unable to, we'll just say unable to complete his term, and if J.D. Vance, for instance, comes in and has any appreciable time in the position, one of the questions is if Trump is still around and active to be able to make a to react to how the new candidate comes in. I think we do see that Trump, he does have a sensitivity to personal attacks or feeling slighted. I think he has a healthy ego. And so any new candidate would want to be very careful about being too critical. I think that was Kamala's challenge, right? She had to decide how critical, because she would have strengthened her position had she been critical of Biden.
Sure.
And she chose not to. And there was the one, I think, kind of penultimate moment where people asked about, what would you change? And
She
she
couldn't come
balked
up
at
with
it.
anything.
And so that I would say it's the same thing with Trump. I think the biggest thing that you'll get, I think another candidate, if the economy is doing well, another candidate has a very good chance of succeeding Trump if they can convince the public that they're going to continue the strength, they're going to continue the restraint on government, they're going to continue the focus on American interests, but they're going to change the tone. I think people are going to be exhausted by, and it's as much a feature of social media as it is the personality in the White House right now, in my view. But if somebody can convince the public we're going to change the tone, because I still think that I think right now the Democrats are in trouble because I think that they're on the wrong side of a lot of 80-20 issues. And while some of those change over time, I think there are some that probably won't, certainly not within this next cycle. And so they're going to have a hard time with that, and trying to deal with that. And they're going to have a hard time whittling away at the suspicions of a working class that is not at all favorable to the Democratic Party. So the extent to which the Republican candidate in that next general election is a change agent on policy, that's really going to be driven by what's going on economically and international political relationships and war and so on and so forth. But if things are kind of static and have recovered, I mean, right now the stock market's doing pretty well, and there are a number of things. I don't like $8 boxes of Lucky Charms, but I don't think anybody does. But if the economy is doing well at that time, I think the change agent component is going to be a change in tone. If there are problems with the economy and with what's going on in the world, I think then they would have to be a much more assertive claim. They'd have to make a much stronger claim that they're going to change the policy direction and try to be more focused on putting food on the table.
The problem is Americans are predisposed to believe that the economy is not doing well. Uh, Biden's economy, depending on which part of America you might ask, was doing well or poorly. If you were a person who had stocks in the stock market, your stocks were at all-time highs. Unemployment was very low under Biden. The GDP continued to grow to some extent. We never had any recessions. But those aren't the majority of the voters. The majority of the voters are people with families and people who feel their personal economy is not what they would like it to be. And so it's going to be difficult to see how that cuts. And I think the party that gets their finger on the pulse of which economy are we talking about, whose economy are we talking about, is going to be more successful. And Trump seems to have the finger on that pulse better. The Republican Party seems to have its finger on the pulse better, doesn't it?
I think so. At least that's, in terms of the results that we saw in the last election, that there was that connection. But, I watching what's happened with like the tariffs, for instance, and what impact that is having, and obviously the alarm bells being sounded by the opposition at every turn. And then, of course, when things turn out okay, the opposition never comes back and says, "Oops, our bad." It's just on to the next kind of critique. but that happens both ways. Um, I really felt that the Trump imposition of tariffs was a strategy, kind of an America First strategy. And I expected reactions from other countries to keep access to the American markets. And, because previous administrations, including Trump's own, have allowed other countries to engage in protectionism of their manufacturing and other industries, and we were kind of left on our own. Whereas, the Republican leadership has tended to be more of a Milton Friedman kind of concept that tariffs are bad under any circumstance, even as a form of protectionism. Not everybody believes that, or not everybody feels that way. And so I kind of felt that that was less of a function of him really wanting to raise a lot of revenue, although it appears that there has been substantial revenue. The question is, where's it coming from? And, eventually gets passed on to the price of goods, only to the extent that the tariff-ridden good is still the cheapest, because it could, move you to an American-made product would normally be more expensive, but now is less expensive. We won't go into that whole thing. But I kind of thought that was more of a strategic thing, and he made those very brash claims, right? We're going to have all these deals and so on. There have been a couple, but I don't know that they've quite met the claims at the outset. But we'll see as time goes how many countries respond to that. It's just really hard to find a good objective source to tell you exactly what's going on, because so much of the media sources now, whether it's the old traditional broadcast type or whether it's online, everybody's got an angle, it seems, and so it's hard to get a real good, clear perspective. But I do agree. I think it's going to be a challenge for both parties to figure out how to touch that chord with the voting public. My big concern, and this goes back to my strong dislike of deficit spending and debt, is our politicians, our public office seekers, are rewarded for short-term results despite long-term effects. And so I think that, one of the fastest ways you make the economy rich right now is you do a bunch of artificial income raising, through increased minimum wage and all these other kinds of things. It is kind of funny to listen to people on the left talking about, you're going to raise tariffs and that's going to just be passed on to the consumer, but raising wages artificially, somehow that money just comes out of the ether, just no, that gets added on to the price of goods as well, and the price of services and everything else. So they have that same impact. But you can make a certain population happy with those kinds of considerations. You can print a whole bunch more money, and as long as people keep believing in it, we're okay. But at some point in time, when people say, based on the inflation rate, I don't trust the dollar anymore. Hopefully we're a long way from that, but other countries have experienced that. You can release a bunch of money in the economy and make it look artificially really strong because people are getting raises and there's a lot of money available for credit and so on and so forth. But in the long run, it becomes very, very hard to rein back in, as we see now with such a huge percentage of our federal budget just servicing the existing national debt. So
Yeah, over $1 trillion a year. I'm going to give one of our readers the final question today. We have a reader has asked, a listener has asked this question from Doug in Minnetonka, also in our congressional district, and it's about the demographic factors. Do trends in demographic factors among the voting populace favor Democrats or Republicans today? If you'd asked that question 10 years ago, the Democrats were sure that with the rise of the identity groups that they identified with, the Hispanic population and young people, that they were in the driver's seat. But now that seems to have flipped. Where do you see the demographic factors playing into future elections?
well, this is the next hour, and I know we're drawing near here. That's a great question, and I think that when you say, does it favor the Democrats or does it favor the Republicans, my answer is yes. I think you're seeing different groups. I've seen some really strong indicators that some groups, like folks that are coming from South Asia, people from India, people from Pakistan, people from it's a highly educated population generally, hardworking, really focused on opportunity, um, very conservative in their thinking, and then you have other groups that are very much kind of identifying with the Democratic perspective. One of the real interest, this is a fascinating topic to me, and I've spent a lot of time in it. But I had a lot of interaction with the Hmong community. It's now becoming ancient history a couple decades ago. But what was so interesting about the Hmong community is they were freedom fighters against communism. They were uh, it's a remarkable population, and so they were very strongly they liked Reagan because Reagan is ultimately the one who brought the entry, but Paul Wellstone was the one that got the legislation through that exempted the Hmong population from the English requirement for citizenship. So you had all these interesting dynamics going on, and right now, if you look at the legislature and other politics, the Hmong population is very active within the Democratic Party. But in terms of their viewpoint and their focus on family and all these other kinds of things, they're actually a pretty conservative group of folks. And as the diaspora makes its way out into the community and is less sort of culturally um, um, uh, concentrated, you're going to start to see some of those numbers change. And we have been seeing those numbers change. And it's the same with the Black community. I think that eventually it's going to be a lot harder to pit people's race against their political views, which I think has been a pretty key factor. And obviously reaching out to young folks. One of the things that I've observed in my now fairly extensive time with watching the Republican Party is the Republican Party is really bad at reaching out to folks. There's this, I don't want to call it arrogance, or maybe it's a form of ignorance, but this idea that our ideas are so good. Why isn't it just apparent to everybody else how good these ideas are, as opposed to going out and giving stake? Because to some extent, when you're the party that believes everybody should be treated equally, going out and pandering to a specific group because of a demographic trait is contrary to the underlying principle of what the party stands for and where the party has been since pre-1860. And so I just think that as different groups develop, as they attain economic success, and as they start to compare their own personal values against what's being offered by the different parties, I do think you're going to see a much more diverse group of Republican voters. May not happen as quickly as the Republicans need in some of the upcoming elections, but I think over time you're going to see a much different blend of that. And it's again, I don't want to take us over here, but looking at the Muslim community is actually a pretty conservative community in terms of a lot of social issues. The Democrats, very strong advocates for in the feminist movement, but they look the other way when it comes to traditional dress. I always talk about what would happen if as a practicing Catholic I had my daughters go to school dressed in nun habits. Some people would be calling Child Protective Services, but in this current immigrant stage, Nike is putting out ads about so celebrating it. So there's a lot of cultural interaction that's going to occur over time, and eventually I think it's going to come down more to ideas and less about sort of focusing on trying to pit different groups against each other.
Well,
And
that'll be a happy day. This
I
has been a happy day for me.
I'm
I
agree.
appreciate the time you have taken with me and with our viewers on the Extremely Not Extreme podcast, Darrin. We'll be back in touch. I will certainly ask you to come back again in the future because we could continue this conversation for a very long time. So thank you. Next time on episode 5, we will have a different format, a young Republican, not that Darrin's not a young Republican, and
Uh,
a young Democrat. And I will be asking them and probing what do they, on behalf of their age group, want from their own political parties? What does the Republican want from his party and the Democrat want from his party going forward. So that'll be interesting, and we'll hope you'll all be back. Thank you again, Darrin. You were excellent, and we'll say goodbye to everyone today. And thank you
Thank you
for
very
watching.
much thanks for having me. I enjoyed the dialogue and look forward to continuing it.
Great. Thank you.